The screech of metal on metal echoed through the tunnel as the 6 train lurched to a violent stop. Sarah Chen pressed her face against the grimy window, watching sparks fly in the darkness ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, we're being held momentarily by train traffic ahead. The conductor's voice crackled over the intercom, but something was wrong. His voice was shaking. That's when she saw them. Dozens of figures stumbling along the tracks in the emergency lighting, their movements jerky and unnatural. One turned toward their train, its face a mess of torn flesh and milky white eyes. Sarah's breath fogged the glass as she whispered, "Oh God, what happened up there?" What started as a routine Tuesday evening commute home would become the longest night of Sarah's life. Trapped 150 feet below Manhattan with 37 other passengers as the city above them descended into chaos. This is the story of Car 4 of the northbound 6 train, the last subway car to make it out of the initial outbreak zone alive. Welcome back to Sinister Stories. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe and drop a comment with your favorite horror topic. We read every single one and use your suggestions for future episodes. Sarah Chen had made this commute 1,000 times before. The 6 train from her office in Midtown to her apartment in the Upper East Side was as routine as breathing. She'd learned to tune out the screech of brakes, the garbled announcements, even the occasional crazy person shouting about the end times. Tuesday, October 15th, started like any other, until it didn't. The train had been moving normally through the 59th Street station when the lights flickered. Not unusual for the MTA's aging infrastructure. But then came the grinding sound, like metal teeth being ripped apart, and the train jerked to such an abrupt halt that passengers flew forward in their seats. "Sorry folks, we're being held momentarily by train traffic ahead," the conductor announced. But his voice carried an edge that made Sarah look up from her phone. Around her, 37 other passengers stirred restlessly. The businessman in the expensive suit checked his Rolex with irritation. The college student with purple hair sighed and turned up her music. An elderly woman clutched her purse tighter. Minutes crawled by. Sarah pressed her face against the window, trying to see past the emergency lighting that cast everything in an eerie orange glow. They were somewhere between 68th and 77th Street, she estimated, deep in the tunnel system that snaked beneath Manhattan's Upper East Side like concrete arteries. That's when she noticed something moving in the darkness ahead. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties." The conductor's voice crackled again, but now there was no mistaking the tremor in his tone. "We ask for your patience as we work to resolve the situation." Sarah squinted through the grimy glass. There were definitely people on the tracks, maybe a dozen figures stumbling along in the dim emergency lighting. Transit workers probably, dealing with whatever mechanical failure had stopped their train. But something about their movement seemed off, disjointed, like marionettes being operated by a drunk puppeteer. "What's the holdup?" barked the businessman, loud enough for the whole car to hear. He stood up, swaying slightly as the train settled on its springs. "I've got a dinner meeting at 8. "Sit down, buddy," muttered a construction worker near the back. "We're all stuck here." The college girl pulled out her earbuds. "Anyone else's phone not working? I can't get any bars down here." Sarah checked her own phone. No signal. That was unusual. The MTA had installed cell boosters throughout most of the system years ago. She tried calling her roommate Lisa, but the call wouldn't go through. A soft thudding sound echoed through the car, then another. It was coming from ahead from the direction of the figures on the tracks. Sarah pressed her ear to the window and heard something that made her blood run cold. A low, guttural moaning that seemed to be getting closer. "Hey, conductor," the businessman shouted toward the front of the car. "What's really going on up there?" The intercom crackled to life, but instead of the conductor's voice, they heard what sounded like shouting. Then a crash, then static. The emergency lighting flickered once, twice, then stabilized, casting dancing shadows through the car. That's when one of the figures on the tracks turned toward their train, and Sarah saw its face clearly for the first time. The thing that had once been human pressed its face against the window 3 cars ahead, leaving a smear of dark liquid across the glass. Even from this distance, Sarah could see that half its jaw was missing, hanging by strips of torn flesh. Its eyes were clouded white like cataracts, but they seemed to track movement inside the train. "Jesus Christ," whispered the construction worker. He was standing now, along with most of the other passengers, all trying to get a better look at what was happening ahead. What the hell is that thing? More figures emerged from the darkness of the tunnel, shuffling toward the stopped train with that same jerky, unnatural gait. They moved without purpose or coordination, bumping into each other, into the tunnel walls, but always gravitating toward the subway cars like moths to a flame. The businessman was frantically jabbing at his phone. "Still no signal. This is ridiculous. We need to get out of here." "And go where?" snapped an older woman with graying hair. "We're 150 feet underground in the middle of Manhattan. There's nowhere to go." A young mother clutched her toddler closer as more of the creatures gathered around the train. The child had been fussing earlier, but now sat silent and wide-eyed, as if sensing the danger that the adults were only beginning to comprehend. The intercom squealed with feedback. Then a new voice came through, higher-pitched, terrified. "This is transit control. All passengers remain in your seats and do not. I repeat, do not attempt to exit the train. Emergency services are, oh God, they're in the control room, they're..." The transmission cut to static. Sarah's hands shook as she watched more figures shamble out of the tunnel's depths. They were gathering around the train now, dozens of them, their rotting hands pressed against the windows and doors. The sound of their moaning filled the car, a chorus of hunger and decay that seemed to vibrate through the metal itself. The longest night of their lives had just begun. The pounding started 20 minutes after the transmission went dead. Sharp, rhythmic banging against the side of their car that made everyone jump. Sarah pressed herself against the opposite wall as a figure in an MTA uniform stumbled into view outside her window. "Help me!" the transit worker screamed, his voice muffled by the thick glass but still audible. "Please, let me in! They're coming!" The man looked normal at first glance, middle-aged, heavy-set, wearing the standard blue MTA shirt and reflective vest. But as he pressed his face against the window, Sarah saw the deep scratches across his neck, still bleeding freely. His eyes were wild with terror, darting constantly toward the tunnel behind him. "We have to help him," said the young mother, standing up with her toddler still in her arms. "He's hurt." "No way," the construction worker replied firmly. He was a big guy, maybe 50, with calloused hands and a no-nonsense attitude. "Something's not right here, you see what's out there." He gestured toward the growing crowd of shambling figures surrounding the train. The transit worker continued pounding on the door, leaving bloody handprints on the metal. "Please, I'm not infected, I can prove it, just let me in." "Infected?" the elderly woman repeated sharply. "What does he mean, infected?" The businessman had moved to the front of the car, studying the emergency door controls. "There's got to be a manual release for these doors. Driver must have the controls locked down." "Don't even think about it," the construction worker warned. "We don't know what's happening out there, but we're safe in here. Soon as we open those doors." The pounding intensified. The transit worker was crying now, tears streaming down his face as he begged. Behind him, more figures emerged from the darkness of the tunnel, but these moved differently, slower, more deliberate. And when the emergency lighting caught their faces, it was clear they were far beyond help. "They're getting closer," Sarah whispered, watching the approaching horde with growing dread. The first of the infected reached the transit worker. While he was still pleading for entry, Sarah watched in horror as rotting hands grabbed the man's shoulders, spinning him around. His screams echoed through the tunnel as teeth sank into his neck, tearing away chunks of flesh. "Don't look," the young mother said to her child, covering the toddler's eyes. But she couldn't look away herself, transfixed by the brutal scene unfolding just feet away. The transit worker fought back initially, throwing wild punches that barely fazed his attackers. But there were too many of them, and within seconds he disappeared beneath a writhing mass of bodies. The sounds that came next, the wet tearing, the gurgling screams that slowly faded to nothing, made several passengers turn away in revulsion. "We need to get out of here," the businessman said, his earlier arrogance replaced by barely controlled panic. "Right now." "And go where?" demanded the construction worker. "You want to end up like that guy?" The college student with purple hair had gone pale, her hand shaking as she filmed the scene with her phone. "This is insane. This can't be real. People they don't do that." "Put that thing away," snapped the elderly woman. "This isn't entertainment." The feeding frenzy outside their car continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When it finally ended, the transit worker was gone, just scattered pieces of torn clothing and dark stains on the concrete platform. But something else had changed. The man who had been begging for help was standing again. His throat was a ragged mess of torn flesh, his MTA uniform soaked with blood, but he was moving. The same jerky, purposeless shamble as the others. And when he turned toward their car, his eyes had that same milky white appearance. "He's dead," whispered the young mother. "That man is dead, but he's still walking." The newly turned transit worker joined the growing crowd pressed against their train, his bloody hands leaving fresh smears on the glass as he pawed at the windows with mindless hunger. "Okay, everyone just stay calm," the construction worker said, though his own voice was tight with stress. "We're safe in here. These doors are solid steel. Whatever's happening out there, we just need to wait it out." "Wait it out?" The businessman laughed, a sharp, hysterical sound. "Did you see what just happened? That man was eaten alive and then got back up. This isn't some civil unrest or terrorist attack. This is a zombie outbreak," the college student finished quietly. "Like in the movies." Several passengers scoffed, but their protests sounded hollow even to themselves. The evidence was right outside their windows. Dozens of people who moved like the living dead, who had torn apart a man with their bare hands and teeth, who showed no signs of intelligence or humanity. The young mother had found a seat in the corner, rocking her toddler gently. "The radio," she said suddenly. "There was an emergency radio in the conductor's cabin. We need to find out what's happening up there on the surface." "I'll check it out," volunteered a teenage boy who'd been quiet until now. He was maybe 16, tall and skinny with nervous energy. "I know trains. My dad works for Metro North." He made his way carefully to the front of the car, stepping over scattered purses and briefcases that had been dropped during the initial panic. The conductor's cabin was locked, but the window was partially open. "I can hear it," he called back to the others. "There's definitely a radio in there, and it's picking up something." Outside, the infected continued their mindless vigil, pressing against every window and door of the train. Their moaning had become a constant background noise, like the hum of machinery. But occasionally, Sarah could hear something else. Distant screams echoing through the tunnel system, the sound of metal being torn apart, and once what might have been gunfire. Whatever was happening on the surface, it was spreading fast, and their subway car was no longer just stopped, it was trapped. The teenager, who'd introduced himself as Marcus, managed to jimmy open the conductor's cabin door using a Metro card and sheer determination. The emergency radio crackled to life as he adjusted the frequency, cycling through static until he found a clear signal. "Emergency broadcast system, this is not a test. All residents of Manhattan are advised to shelter in place immediately. Do not attempt to travel on foot. Avoid all contact with infected individuals." The broadcast cut to static, then picked up a different station. National Guard units are being deployed to establish a perimeter around Central Park, where the initial outbreak appears to have originated. Preliminary reports suggest the infection spreads through bodily fluids, specifically saliva from bite wounds. "Central Park," Sarah repeated. "That's only a few blocks from here." The businessman was pacing now, his expensive suit wrinkled and sweat-stained. "We need to get topside. My car is parked at 72nd and Lex. If we can reach it." "You're not listening," interrupted the construction worker. "They're telling people to shelter in place. That means it's bad up there. Really bad." Marcus continued scanning frequencies. Most stations were playing the same emergency broadcast on loop, but occasionally they caught fragments of news reports or emergency services chatter. "Hospital overrun with casualties. Requesting immediate backup. Infection rate appears to be 100% fatal, with reanimation occurring within minutes of death." Brooklyn Bridge closed. Manhattan Bridge closed. All tunnels sealed by order of... The radio dissolved into static again. Marcus tried to retune it, but the signal was gone. Did he say tunnels sealed? Asked the elderly woman, her face pale. The young mother looked up from where she'd been trying to keep her toddler calm. That means we can't get out. Even if we make it to a subway entrance, they've probably sealed those too. Outside their car, the infected continued their restless movement. Sarah had been watching them, trying to understand their behavior. They seemed drawn to movement and sound, clustering around areas where passengers were most active. When someone spoke loudly or moved quickly, more of them would press against that section of the train. Everyone needs to keep it down, Sarah warned. I think they're attracted to noise. As if to prove her point, the toddler began crying. Not the usual fussing of a bored child, but the high-pitched wail of genuine fear. Immediately, the infected outside their section became more agitated, pressing harder against the windows, their moaning growing louder. Shh, baby, please, the young mother whispered desperately, trying to comfort her child. Please be quiet. But the damage was done. More infected shuffled toward their car from deeper in the tunnel, drawn by the sound. Sarah counted at least 60 now, maybe more. They were packed so tightly against the train that she couldn't see the platform beyond them. Marcus had managed to get the radio working again, cycling through emergency frequencies. CDC estimates infection rate at 30% of Manhattan's population and climbing. Recommend immediate evacuation of all surrounding boroughs. President has authorized tactical nuclear option if containment fails. That last transmission made everyone freeze. The businessman stopped pacing. The construction worker's face went ashen. Nuclear option? Whispered the college student. They're talking about nuking Manhattan? They wouldn't, the elderly woman said, but she didn't sound convinced. There are millions of people here. There were millions of people here, the construction worker corrected grimly. Question is, how many are still alive? The radio crackled with a new voice, clearer than the others, less official. This is Officer Rodriguez, NYPD Transit Bureau. Any MTA personnel monitoring this frequency. I'm trapped at the 86th Street station with approximately 20 civilians. The surface entrance has been overrun. I repeat, do not attempt to reach street level. The infected are everywhere. If anyone is receiving this transmission... The signal cut to screaming, then static. Marcus tried to raise the officer, keying the radio's transmit button. Officer Rodriguez, this is the 6th train stopped between 68th and 77th Street. We have 38 passengers. Do you copy? Nothing but static answered him. They were on their own. Hours crawled by like days. The emergency lighting had dimmed, probably to conserve power, casting everything in a sickly amber glow. Someone had found a few bottles of water and some snacks in various purses and briefcases, but it wasn't much for 38 people. The businessman, who'd finally introduced himself as Richard Kellerman, had appointed himself unofficial leader, much to everyone's annoyance. We need to ration what we have, he announced. No one knows how long we'll be down here. Nobody put you in charge, muttered the construction worker whose name was Tony Ramirez. Someone needs to take charge, Richard shot back. We can't just sit here hoping for rescue. Actually, that's exactly what we should do, Tony replied. It's safer down here than up there. You heard the radio. The whole city's gone to hell. The young mother, Jessica, had finally gotten her daughter Emma to sleep. The 2-year-old was curled up across 2 seats, using Jessica's jacket as a blanket. She's burning up, Jessica whispered to Sarah, who was sitting nearby. I think she's getting sick. Sarah felt the child's forehead. It was definitely warm. Could be stress, she said, though privately she was worried. Kids react badly to situations like this. But even as she said it, Sarah couldn't shake the memory of those radio transmissions. Infection spreads through bodily fluids. What if the child wasn't just stressed? What if somehow, some way, the infection had found its way into their sealed environment? Marcus had given up on the radio for now, but he'd been studying the subway maps posted inside the car. There's a maintenance tunnel about half a mile south of here, he said quietly to Sarah and Tony. If we could get out of the car and make it that far. Are you insane? Tony hissed. You saw what happened to that transit worker. Soon as we opened those doors, we're dead. Outside, the infected had settled into an eerie stillness. They were still there. Sarah could see their silhouettes pressed against the windows, but they'd stopped their constant movement. It was almost as if they were waiting for something, or someone to make a mistake. Emma's condition worsened as the night wore on. The toddler's fever spiked, and she began having difficulty breathing. Jessica held her daughter close, tears streaming down her face, as she felt the child's small body burning with heat. We need to get her to a hospital, Jessica pleaded. She's really sick. This isn't just stress. The hospitals are overrun, Tony reminded her gently. You heard the radio reports. Then what do you want me to do, just watch my baby die? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah knelt beside Jessica, checking Emma's pulse. It was rapid and thready. The child's breathing had become shallow, labored. Without medical attention, Sarah feared the worst. There might be medical supplies at one of the stations, Marcus suggested. Emergency kits, first aid equipment. And how exactly do you propose we get there? Richard demanded. Walk through that? He gestured toward the windows where dozens of infected still pressed against the glass. The maintenance tunnel I mentioned, Marcus said. It connects to the 77th Street station. There's bound to be emergency medical equipment there. That's a half-mile walk through infected territory, Tony pointed out. It's better than sitting here watching a child die, Jessica snapped, her desperation boiling over. The argument was interrupted by a new sound, metal groaning under pressure. Everyone froze, listening. It came again, a sharp crack, followed by the screech of bending steel. What was that? Whispered the elderly woman whose name was Dorothy. Marcus moved to the front of the car, peering through the conductor's window. Oh hell, he breathed. They're trying to pry open the doors on the front car. Through the dim lighting, they could see infected crowded around the lead car's doors, their fingers wedged into the narrow gap between the panels. More joined them, adding their strength to the effort. The metal was giving way slowly but steadily. How long until they get through? Sarah asked. At this rate? Maybe an hour. Maybe less. Their safe haven was about to become a trap. Panic rippled through the car as the reality of their situation sank in. Some passengers began checking the doors and windows of their own car, looking for weaknesses that the infected might exploit. Others gathered their belongings, preparing for the possibility of having to run. We need a plan, Tony said, taking charge now that Richard seemed to have lost his nerve. Marcus, you're sure about this maintenance tunnel? Pretty sure. It should connect to the emergency exit at 77th Street, but we'd have to get there without being seen. How many of those things are out there? Marcus did another count through the windows. Maybe 80, 90. Hard to tell in the dark. Too many to fight through, Tony concluded. We'd need a distraction. I'll do it, Richard said suddenly. Everyone turned to look at him. The businessman's face was pale but determined. I'll create a distraction. Draw them away from the tunnel entrance. That's suicide, Dorothy protested. Maybe. But that little girl doesn't deserve to die because we're too scared to act. He looked at Jessica, who was still holding Emma's feverish body. I've got a daughter about her age. If it were her... Tony nodded slowly. If you're serious about this, we'll need to coordinate. Sarah, you and Jessica take the kid and follow Marcus to the tunnel. Dorothy and I will help Richard with the distraction. I'm not leaving without my daughter, Jessica said firmly. You're not. We're all going. But we need to move smart in stages. Richard draws them off, we make for the tunnel, then we regroup at the station. A new sound interrupted their planning. The shriek of metal giving way completely. The doors of the lead car burst open with a crash that echoed through the tunnel. The infected poured inside like water through a broken dam. Screams erupted from the front car as passengers who'd been trapped there for hours met their fate. The sounds were horrible, tearing flesh, breaking bone, desperate pleas for mercy that went unanswered. We're out of time, Tony said grimly. Everyone ready? because this is happening now. The emergency exit at the rear of their car required 2 people to operate, one to release the manual lock, another to pull the heavy door open. Tony and Marcus worked together while the others gathered near the exit, clutching whatever makeshift weapons they'd been able to find. Sarah had torn a leg off one of the plastic seats, creating a crude club. Dorothy gripped a fire extinguisher like a baseball bat. Richard had removed his belt, wrapping it around his knuckles as a sort of brass knuckles. "Remember, we stick together no matter what," Tony whispered. "Anyone falls behind, we don't leave them." The sounds from the front car were getting closer. The infected had finished with the passengers there and were starting to explore, drawn by the scent of fresh prey just 1 car away. "Now," Tony hissed. The door opened with a pneumatic hiss. Cool tunnel air rushed in, carrying the smell of damp concrete and something else. Decay, like garbage left too long in summer heat. Richard went first, sprinting toward the far end of the platform where he'd spotted a maintenance ladder. "Hey, over here, you rotting bastards," he shouted, banging his belt buckle against a metal pipe. The response was immediate. Infected throughout the tunnel turned toward the sound, shambling in Richard's direction. But not all of them. Sarah counted at least 20 still gathered around their car, seemingly uninterested in the businessman's distraction. "Go, go, go," Tony urged. Jessica clutched Emma tightly as they dropped down onto the tracks. The little girl was barely conscious now, her breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. They had minutes, maybe less, before she slipped away entirely. Marcus led them along the narrow walkway beside the electrified 3rd rail, moving as quickly and quietly as possible. Behind them, they could hear Richard's voice growing more distant as he led the infected away from the tunnel entrance. Ahead, the maintenance tunnel yawned like an open mouth, dark and forbidding but promising escape from the nightmare that had consumed their world. They had made it maybe 50 yards when Emma stopped breathing entirely. Jessica's scream when Emma stopped breathing echoed through the tunnel like a banshee's wail. Every infected within a quarter-mile radius turned toward the sound, their milky eyes searching for the source of fresh prey. "Jessica, no," Sarah hissed, but it was too late. The young mother had collapsed beside the tracks, cradling her daughter's lifeless body, her sobs carrying through the darkness like a dinner bell for the dead. The infected that had remained near their subway car began shuffling toward them with renewed purpose. Behind them, more shapes emerged from the deeper tunnels, refugees from other subway cars, other platforms, all drawn by Jessica's grief. "We have to move," Marcus urged, but Jessica wouldn't budge. "I'm not leaving her," she sobbed. "I'm not leaving my baby." Tony knelt beside her, his voice gentle but urgent. "Jessica, Emma's gone. If we stay here, we're all going to die. She wouldn't want that. You don't know what she'd want. You don't know anything." Sarah could see the infected getting closer, a shambling wall of decay and hunger stretching across the tunnel. In the distance, Richard's voice had gone silent, which could only mean one thing. "Dorothy, help me with Jessica," Sarah ordered. The elderly woman nodded, taking Jessica's other arm as they tried to lift her. "Leave me alone." Jessica struggled against them, still clutching Emma's body. That's when Marcus did something that shocked everyone. He reached down and gently took Emma from her mother's arms. "I'll carry her," he said simply. "But we have to go. Now." Something in his tone broke through Jessica's hysteria. She looked up at him, saw the kindness in his young face, and nodded through her tears. They ran. The maintenance tunnel was a narrow concrete tube, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, and the floor was slick with decades of grime. Their footsteps echoed despite their efforts to move quietly, but stealth was no longer an option. Behind them, the moaning of the infected grew louder as more joined the pursuit. The tunnel seemed endless. They'd been moving for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 minutes when Dorothy stumbled and fell hard on the concrete floor. Her fire extinguisher clattered away into the darkness. "My ankle," she gasped, trying to push herself up. "I think it's broken." Tony and Sarah helped her to her feet, but it was clear she couldn't put any weight on her left leg. The infected were getting closer. Their moaning echoed off the tunnel walls like some hellish choir. "Go," Dorothy said firmly. "Leave me. I'll slow you down." "Like hell," Tony replied. "Marcus, you take point. Sarah, help me with Dorothy." They fashioned a crude stretcher using their jackets and a piece of rebar Marcus found, but progress slowed to a crawl. Jessica had gone silent, walking like a zombie herself, her eyes never leaving her daughter's body in Marcus's arms. The first infected appeared around a bend in the tunnel behind them, the transit worker who'd been turned outside their subway car. His MTA uniform was now shredded and soaked with blood, but he moved with the same relentless purpose as all the others. "There," Marcus pointed ahead to a faint square of lighter darkness, the emergency exit. But as they approached, their hearts sank. The exit was blocked by a heavy metal grate, secured with a chain and padlock. "Can we break it?" Sarah asked desperately. Marcus examined the lock. "Maybe, but it'll take time and make noise." Behind them, the infected transit worker had been joined by dozens of others. They filled the tunnel from wall to wall, a tide of death and decay that would reach them in minutes. "Stand back," Tony said, hefting Dorothy's fire extinguisher. "This is going to be loud." He brought the heavy canister down on the lock again and again, sparks flying with each impact. The metal held, but the chain was starting to weaken. The infected were less than 50 yards away when the lock finally shattered. They burst through the emergency exit into another nightmare. The 77th Street station was a charnel house. Bodies were scattered across the platform, some clearly dead, others in various states of decay, still moving with that characteristic infected shuffle. The walls were painted with blood and worse things, and the air was thick with the smell of death. "Sweet Jesus," Dorothy whispered. But there was no time to process the horror. The infected from the tunnel were pouring through the emergency exit behind them, and more were shambling toward them from the platform ahead. "The stairs," Marcus shouted, pointing toward the station exit. "We have to reach the surface." They fought their way across the platform, using their makeshift weapons to clear a path through the scattered infected. Sarah's plastic club shattered against a skull, so she grabbed a fallen police officer's baton. Tony wielded the fire extinguisher like a warhammer, crushing heads with methodical efficiency. Jessica had found her fight again, protecting her daughter's body with a fury that kept the infected at bay. "Stay away from her!" she screamed, kicking and clawing at anything that came near. The stairs stretched upward into darkness, but they could see faint daylight filtering down from the surface. Dawn was breaking over what remained of Manhattan. They climbed as fast as they could with Dorothy's injury, but the infected were right behind them. Sarah could hear their footsteps, their hungry moaning, getting closer with each step. At the top of the stairs, they found the station entrance partially collapsed. A delivery truck had crashed through the street above, creating a barrier of twisted metal and concrete that they'd have to climb over to reach the surface. "I can't make it," Dorothy gasped, her face gray with pain and exhaustion. "Yes, you can," Tony insisted. But even as he said it, infected hands grabbed at Dorothy's legs from below. She looked back at the others one last time, smiled, and let go. "Go!" she shouted as she disappeared into the horde. "Get them out of here." Sarah, Tony, Marcus, and Jessica climbed through the wreckage toward whatever waited for them in the ruins of New York City. When Sarah Chen finally crawled through the wreckage into the pale morning light, Manhattan looked like a movie set after filming Wrapped. Abandoned cars scattered across the streets, broken windows reflecting the sunrise like dead eyes, and in the distance, smoke rising from a dozen different fires. But they were alive. 4 survivors out of 38 passengers who'd started that routine Tuesday evening commute. 4 people who'd witnessed the first moments of humanity's darkest chapter and lived to tell about it. Jessica found a small patch of grass in a nearby park where she finally laid Emma to rest, using stones to mark the spot. Marcus helped her fashion a simple cross from broken tree branches. Tony kept watch, his fire extinguisher still in hand, ready to defend their small moment of humanity in an inhuman world. The radio reports they'd heard in the tunnel proved accurate. Central Park had indeed been ground zero. though no one ever figured out exactly what had caused the outbreak. Government theories ranged from biological weapons to experimental viruses to something far stranger that official reports still refuse to acknowledge. What mattered was that it spread fast, faster than anyone thought possible. By the time authorities understood what they were dealing with, it was already too late for containment. The bridges and tunnels sealed, trapping millions of people on an island that had become a feeding ground for the dead. Sarah's group made it to a military evacuation point in Queens 3 days later, walking through neighborhoods that looked like war zones. They were among the lucky few. Official estimates put the survival rate at less than 2% of Manhattan's population. The subway system, ironically, became one of the safest places during those first crucial hours. The sealed environment that had felt like a tomb actually protected passengers from the chaos above, but that protection only lasted as long as the doors held. Jessica never spoke much after that night. She'd lost everything that mattered to her in those dark tunnels beneath the city. But sometimes in the refugee camps that followed, Sarah would catch her staring at the trains that carried supplies to the survivors, and she knew Jessica was remembering their daughter, remembering Emma's last moments in the underground darkness where New York's nightmare began. Marcus went on to help design the new transit systems in the rebuilt cities, incorporating what he'd learned about emergency protocols and evacuation procedures. He never rode a subway again without thinking about that maintenance tunnel, about Dorothy's sacrifice, about how quickly civilization could crumble when the lights went out. Tony became something of a legend among the survivors, the construction worker who'd kept his head when everyone else was losing theirs. He'd joke that dealing with infected wasn't that different from dealing with difficult contractors, but his eyes never lost that haunted look from the night they'd fought their way through hell. And Sarah? Sarah learned that sometimes the most ordinary moments, a routine commute home, a Tuesday evening ride on the 6 train, can become the most extraordinary tests of human endurance and courage. The last NYC subway car taught them all that survival isn't about being the strongest or the fastest or the smartest. It's about the choices you make when everything falls apart, the people you choose to save, and the humanity you hold on to when the world around you loses its mind. So there you have it, the story of Car 4 of the northbound 6 train, and the ordinary people who faced the extraordinary when the world ended underground. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What would you do if you found yourself trapped in a similar situation? Would you be the one creating distractions to save others, like Richard? Would you take charge and keep everyone calm like Tony? Or would you be the voice of reason trying to hold the group together when everything fell apart? These kinds of stories fascinate us because they strip away all the comfortable illusions we live with every day. They force us to confront the basic question of who we really are, when everything we take for granted disappears in an instant. If you enjoyed this terrifying journey through Manhattan's underground nightmare, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a new episode of Sinister Stories. We've got plenty more tales of horror, survival, and the darker side of human nature coming your way. And here's where you come in. Drop a comment below and tell us what horror topic you'd like to see next. Haunted hospitals, cursed small towns, maybe something about the creatures that lurk in abandoned places. We read every single comment and use your suggestions to craft our next spine-chilling stories. Did this story hit a little too close to home for any fellow New Yorkers out there? Have you ever been stuck on the subway and let your imagination run wild about what might be waiting in those dark tunnels? Share your own subway horror experiences in the comments. The best ones might just inspire our next episode. Until next time, keep your eyes open and your wits about you. You never know when an ordinary Tuesday evening might become the fight of your life. This has been Sinister Stories, Sweet Dreams.